Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this build, I'll be working on the AH-64E Apache Guardian as operated by the Indian Air Force. The IAF currently operates 22 AH-64E Apaches which are split between number 125 Helicopter Squadron, Gladiators and number 137 Squadron, the Vulcans at Pathankot. These helicopters form a major part of India's modern attack helicopter capability, specializing in close air support, anti-armor roles and low-level strike missions. Now the kit I am using here is the Hobby Boss AH-64D Longbow Apache kit. It's actually an AH-64D, so this isn't a straight out of the box build. Over the course of the video, I will be converting it into an E variant, focusing on the areas that really matter visually. Things like updated sensors, fuselage fairing, the rotor blade profile changes, and the mast-mounted longbow radar. This build involved a fair bit of scratch building, mainly using foam board, ABS plastic and epoxy, along with some careful reshaping of the kit parts. The idea wasn't to overcomplicate things, but to push the model just far enough that it clearly reads as an IAF AH-64E, not just a repainted D model. Overall, the build was challenging in a good way. There were a few problem-solving moments, some careful planning and lot of reference checking. But it came together really nicely in the end. So if you are interested in modern helicopters, Indian Air Force subjects, or just seeing how far you can take a kit with some scratch building and patience, you are in the right place. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel. It really helps support future builds. Now let's get started. Signing off, Rahul Kulkarni. Jai Hind, Jai Maharashtra. In this video, I am taking a quick look at what you get inside the box of the Hobby Boss 72nd scale AH-64D Apache Longbow kit. Let's open it up. Inside the box, the parts are packaged in individual plastic bag, which is always a good start and help prevent damage during shipping. Black and white instruction booklet. The instructions are clear and logically laid out with a straightforward build sequence. The rotor head assembly is broken down into several parts which should allow for a reasonably detailed result once assembled. There's also a small decal sheet. The decal sheet provides multiple marking options. The printing looks sharp with good color density, though I will reserve my judgment until they are on the model. The kit consists of multiple grey styrene sprues. The rotor blades are molded straight with subtle surface detail and no obvious warping. Molding quality is generally good. I can see light mold seams and few ejector pin in marks, but nothing that look difficult to clean up, especially at this scale. The engine nacelle, stub wing and tail components are all molded cleanly and alignment pin look positive. Starting with the main fuselage half, surface detail looks sharp. Panel lines are recessed and consistent and rivet detail is present but not overly heavy. There is some fine raised detail as well, particularly around access panel and fasteners. The clear sprue includes the main canopy and sensor glazing. Transparency is good with minimal distortion, though the canopy framing is quite subtle and will require careful masking. So I'm going to start working on the cockpit seats and controls now. First thing I'm doing is just cleaning up these ejector pin marks. There aren't loads of them, but they are in places that will definitely catch the light later. Once that's done, I'm setting up the control column on some blue tack. I'm using the Display Mini Sander for this. This thing is really handy for small parts like this, just to smooth it out a bit. I'm not removing much material at all, just enough to clean up the surface so it looks better once the paint goes on. This just makes life easier when it comes to painting. I don't have to touch them and I can spray everything in one go without worrying about fingerprints. I am spraying black primer over all these cockpit parts. I am keeping the coats pretty light here. This gives me a nice solid base and also makes it easier to spot if I have missed anything during the cleanup, just building it up gradually rather than flooding the part. Once that's dry, I can start assembling the control column and the instrument cover. I also need to sort out this cockpit display cover. Fit is pretty straightforward, so this doesn't take too long. I am just using small amounts of Tamiya extra thin glue and letting the capillary action do its thing. To finish it off, I am doing a bit of dry brushing with ammonic polished metal. This is just to pick out the raised detail and stop everything from looking like a black hole. I am barely touching the brush to the part, just enough to catch the edges. And that's basically it for this stage. It doesn't look like much on its own, but once it's inside the fuselage, it will add a bit of depth and interest. Alright, I'll let this sit for now and move on to the next step. Moving on now, I'm going to start bringing the fuselage together, but before I close anything up, I'm starting with the rocket and gun launcher assembly. These goes together pretty easily. Next up are the hard points under the wings. These will carry the stores later on, so I'm just making sure they are square and sitting straight before the glue sets. Now I'm moving on to the engine intakes. These are built up from a couple of parts. Fit here is decent, but I'm doing a quick dry fit first just to make sure everything lines up before committing with glue. With the intakes done, I can start assembling the engines onto the fuselage. These sit on the sides and are pretty prominent, so alignment is important. Once these are on, the Apache really starts to look like an Apache. Once those are set, I am adding the intake nacelle over the engine. This kind of lock everything together, which is nice, and it helps keep the shape consistent on both sides. Before closing up the fuselage, I also need to add the mounts for the main rotor and the tail rotor. These need to go in now, otherwise there's no way to add them later. I am being a bit careful with glue here so nothing seizes up. Now I am dropping the cockpit seat assembly into one fuselage half. Everything fits as expected, so no surprises here. Alright, moment of truth. Time to bring the two fuselage half together. I am lining up carefully, checking the nose and tail alignment. To keep everything tight, I am using a few clamps along the fuselage. This helps pull the seam together and should reduce how much cleanup I will need later. And once I am happy, I am running some glue along the same. I'll leave this to fully cure overnight. I want to get the canopy taken care of. I have dipped it in future mainly to improve the clarity and give it a bit of protection for later. I will let the excess drip off and then this is going to sit covered and dry overnight. Once it's cured, it's a lot more forgiving when it comes to masking and handling. Next up is the nose sensor assembly. This is one of the more interesting areas on an Apache because this whole section is basically the aircraft eyes. On the real helicopter, this rotating turret houses the TADS and the PNVS. That's the targeting system and the pilot night vision sensor. These provide forward-looking infrared and TV imagery, so the crew can fly and engage targets in low light or bad weather. On the real thing, it's all linked to the helmet display, so the pilot can literally aim the gun just by looking at the target. Obviously, we are simplifying all of that here in plastic, but it's still a really distinctive feature of the Apache. With that done, I am attaching the wings to the fuselage. This slot in pretty well, but I am checking both sides to make sure the angle matches before the glue set. Once these are on, the model really starts to feel solid. Now I can fix the front nose sensor assembly onto the fuselage. I'm dry fitting these parts first because alignment is important. If this sits even slightly off, it's very noticeable right at the front of the aircraft. Finally, I am adding the grab handles. These are tiny and a bit fiddly. So I am taking my time with tweezers and a very small amount of glue. Once they are on, I am leaving them completely alone to set. Fitting the cockpit canopy. I am using Jack's washable clear glue for this. I am not applying this straight from the bottle. Instead, I am taking a toothpick and just picking up really small amount of glue. Then I am running that along the edge of the fuselage right where the canopy is going to sit. Once the glue is on, I am slowly lowering the canopy into place. I will gently nudge it if needed just to make sure it's centered and sitting evenly on both sides. At this point, I am basically hands off. I am going to leave this alone overnight. Once this is fully set, I can move on to masking the canopy and getting ready for paint. Alright, now that the canopy is fully cured, I can move on to masking. I am using Tamiya masking tape for this. I will cut it into thin strips and start laying it along the canopy frame. I am not trying to cover everything in one go. I will outline the frames first, then fill in the larger glass panels with wider pieces of tape. The framing on this canopy is quite subtle. I am also making sure the tape is pressed down properly along the edges, especially in the corners to avoid any paint creep later on. Once everything's masked, I will give it one final check under the light and then it's ready for paint. And that's the canopy mask, nice and clean, and we are good to move on. Alright, at this point I want to pause the build for a moment and talk through some of the key sensors on the AH-64E, especially the ones you will see on the Indian Air Force Apaches, because a few of these aren't represented correctly in the kit. So as I am showing here on the screen, the Eco version has a slightly different sensor and antenna layout compared to the older Delta model. The big one everyone notices is the overall sensor fit around the nose and fuselage. While the basic TADS and PNVS turret is there in the kit, there are additional sensors and fairings on the E model that just aren't included or are simplified too much. I am going to scratch build this part, nothing too extreme but enough to improve the accuracy. For most of these sensors, I am using a combination of foam board and ABS plastic. Foam board is great for quickly blocking out shapes and checking proportions, especially when you are working from photo. Some of these sensors are basically just small boxes or tapered fairing, so scratch building them is actually quicker than trying to modify kit parts. The key thing here is reference photos. I am constantly checking angles and positions so everything sits where it should. This is all about external appearance and making sure that visually this reads as an IAF AH-64E. So this is one of those stages where you don't see instant progress on the model, but it really pays off later once everything's painted and ready. This is a handy small vise that I got from Ustar. It is very useful for cutting these small shapes. These are some boxes on the nose that are going to be fixed. Look cool. Now I use this earbuds pipe and then cut it into two small pieces. These will be again mounted on the nose. And then I am going to put a small toothpick twig into that. Set them with Tamiya extra thin glue, and these are the sensors on the nose. Foam board is great for this because it's easy to cut, easy to adjust, and you can quickly see if the proportions look right. I have already cut a few small pieces here, and this is really just about blocking out the shapes first. Once I am happy with the shape, I am gluing these sensors directly onto the fuselage. I am using a mix of Tamiya cement and Fevikwik depending on the part. I am taking this slow and doing one sensor at a time. Now that the sensors are on, I am just taking a moment to show their locations on the model, so you can see how they sit relative to the nose, fuselage and other reference point. I am using araldite epoxy. This comes in two tubes, one is the resin and other is the hardener. I am mixing them in equal proportions, then applying it over and around the foam board. Next up are the side fairings on the fuselage, which also need to be scratch built for the E version. For this I am using a triangular piece of foam board to get the basic shape. This does two things. It fills any gap and help level the foam board so it blends into the base plastic. I am not trying to make it perfect straight away. This is just about building up the shape. After letting it fully dry, this is how it looks. You can see the fairing is now solid and properly blended. I have also added a bit of grill mesh on top, which really helps sell the look and add some visual interest. Alright, moving on now to the rotor blade, and this is where one of the more visible differences between the D and E version comes in. What I am doing first is comparing the kit blades with the 3D printed E version blades. I have just stacked them one on top of the other so the differences are easy to see. Straight away you can notice the change in the blade tip angle and also a slight chord offset on the E version. I am masking the blades with Tamiya masking tape. This helps give me a clean cutting guide and also protect the rest of the blade while I am working. Now I am using a mini hobby saw to carefully remove the excess tip material. I am not rushing this at all, just slow control cuts and letting the saw do the work. After the rough cut is done, the edge obviously looks a bit messy. To clean that up, I am switching to a mini sander and gently smoothing out the cut edges. The goal here is to match the profile of the E version blade as closely as possible without thinning it too much. I repeat the same process on all 4 blades, and once they are done, you can really see the difference. The shape now looks much closer to what you would expect on an AH-64E. Next I am assembling the tail rotor, which is pretty straightforward, so I won't dwell on that too much. Once that's together, I move back to the main rotor. And finally, on top of the rotor hub, I am adding the mast-mounted radar, officially known as the APG-78 Longbow radar. This is one of the defining features of modern Apaches and a big visual cue that this is an E model. Once that's on, I will just spin it in my hand so you can see how it looks. Now I am assembling the main rotor blades onto the rotor hub, making sure everything is aligned properly so it will sit straight later on. Even without paint, the silhouette already screams Apache. Alright, that the rotor system is done. Next up will be paint and finishing, and this build should really start coming together after that. I am moving on to priming, and for this stage I am using a white primer. Normally you would expect black or grey here, but the reason I am going white is because the final color is going to be Tipnis Gray. White underneath just makes everything brighter and helps the tonal variation show through much better. If I went straight over a dark primer, the grey would look a bit dull and flat, especially at this scale. So this is really about getting more contrast and control in the later paint stages. I am spraying this in light even coats, just building it up slowly. Alright, once this primer is fully dry, the next step will be black pre-shading. I am just spraying thin black lines along the panel line, around access panel and in few recessed areas. This isn't meant to be super neat or heavy, just enough to create some depth underneath the main color. And then we can finally start laying down that Tipnis Gray. I will let this cure properly and pick it up again in the next stage. Now it's time to spray the main color, which is Tipnis Gray. I am applying this in thin control coats, slowly building the color up over the pre-shading. I'm not trying to completely cover the black underneath, just letting a bit of it show through so the surface keeps some depth and variation. Tipnis Gray is named after Air Marshal Prabhakar Tipnis, who was former Chief of the Indian Air Force. During his tenure, this grey scheme became closely associated with modern IAF combat aircraft, particularly on frontline platform operating in varied terrain and lighting conditions. The color itself is designed to be low visibility, working well in both bright daylight and hazy conditions, which makes it practical for aircraft like the Apache that operate at low level. I will let this dry properly before moving on to the next stage. Alright, now that the main paint is fully dry, I am going to put down a high gloss varnish over the entire model. I am spraying this in light even coats, just building up a smooth sheen without flooding any areas. The reason for doing this is mainly for the decals. A gloss surface is nice and smooth, which helps prevent silvering. With a gloss coat down, the decals can settle properly, conform to the surface detail and look more like they are painted on rather than stuck on top. Once this is fully cured, the model will be ready for decals. So I will let this set and move on to the next step. Alright, now I am just going to pick out the E version sensors and paint them black. I am doing this with a fine brush and keeping the paint controlled so it doesn't flood into the surrounding detail. On the real Apache, a lot of these sensors housings are finished in black or very dark tones to reduce glare and help with thermal and optical performance. Painting them separately also helps break up all the grey and adds a bit of visual contrast. Here I am using a chrome pen to paint those shiny surfaces which can be seen on front of the sensors. Just to simulate the silver color or the reflective frame, I am using this chrome marker. This stage is more about precision than speed. Once this dries, the sensors will really stand out and help sell the look of an AH-64E even before the weathering goes on. Now it's time for decals. I am starting with the registration number, which for the Indian Air Force Apaches begin with the ZV series. These go on first so I can make sure they are lined up properly before adding anything else around them. Next I am working through the rest of the decal sheet, adding the stencil and marking where needed. Nothing too heavy here, just enough to give the model some identity without overdoing it. On the tail fin I am adding the Indian Air Force fin flash. Along with the roundels, using reference photos to get the placement right. These really help bring the aircraft to life. And finally, this is the part that wasn't in the original plan. I am adding the shark teeth on the nose. This was special request from my son Nimish because according to him it makes the helicopter look way more dangerous. I can't really argue with that logic. So shark teeth it is. Once these are all settled, I'll seal everything in and move on to the next stage. Alright, next up I'm going to start adding the landing gear and then move on to a bit of panel line wash. The landing gear goes together pretty easily. I'm applying a dark wash into the panel lines and recessed detail, letting capillary action do most of the work. This really helps bring out all the surface detail and breaks up the grey finish. After letting it sit for a bit, I will gently clean off the excess, leaving the wash only in the recesses. It's a subtle step, but it makes a big difference and adds a lot more depth to the model. With the decals and panel line wash done, I am putting down another light coat of Future. This seals everything in and gives me a clean protected surface to work on before weathering. Now I am moving on to weathering. And for this stage I am focusing on the dust buildup you usually see on Apaches operating close to the ground. I am using Camelin pastel colors. mixing a few earthy tones together to get a dust color that matches what I see in the reference photos. I am just scraping the pastels into a fine powder and applying it gently with a soft brush. I am spraying Revel matte varnish to seal in all the weathering and knock back any remaining shine. This helps unify the finish and gives the model that proper in-scale operational look. I am applying this in light even passes, just enough to lock everything in without flooding any of the surface detail. Once this is dry, everything is sealed and protected, and I can finally move on to removing the canopy masking, which is always one of the most satisfying parts of the build. This is always my favorite part of any build, removing the canopy mask. I am taking this slow and peeling the tape back gently, just to avoid lifting any paint along the edges. This is the moment where you find out whether all that patience earlier has actually paid off. And yeah, that looks good. Nice clean frames, no bleed, and the clarity from future coat really shows through now. This is usually where the model suddenly feels almost finished. Overall, it's a clean build with just enough wear to look used, not abused.